Before the dawnlight touched the fields, before the roosters, before even the smallest sound from the barn, I was already awake. Not because I chose to be, because he was standing at the edge of the bed. No words, no gentleness, just the weight of his expectation filling the dark room like something I could not breathe around. The quilt my mother had stitched for my wedding chest was pulled back before I had even fully opened my eyes, and I remember staring at the ceiling, the same ceiling I would stare at 347 more mornings, thinking, this is what I agreed to. This is what a wife is. I was 19 years old. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Kishacoquillas Valley, Pennsylvania, a valley so closed, so quiet, so sealed off from the outside world that the English drove through it sometimes just to look at us, the way you look at something behind glass. I left 8 years ago, and this channel is where I say the things that were never permitted to be said out loud, not in the kitchen, not in the barn, not even in the whisper dark of a bedroom where no one could hear. If you want to hear what plain life actually looks like from the inside of it, not the quilts and the buggies and the peaceful simplicity, subscribe right now and tap the like button. And tell me in the comments, did you grow up somewhere that had rules nobody ever wrote down? Because those are the rules I want to talk about. Now let me tell you what harvest season actually meant in my home, and what my husband believed it permitted him. There is a concept in Amish life that the outside world does not have a clean word for. The ordnung, our unwritten but absolute code, covers everything. What color your curtains can be, how wide the brim of a hat, whether a woman may have a mirror in her bedroom. But underneath the ordnung that gets written about, the one the scholars study and the tourists ask about, there is another layer. A layer that lives only in the space between husband and wife. In the dark, in the silence, in the gap between what is permitted and what is expected and what is demanded and what is simply done because no one ever told you it could be otherwise. Before harvest, a man's authority in the home expands. That is the only way I know how to describe it. The entire community orients around the fields, around getting the corn in before the first freeze, around the hay being dry, around the silo being full before November. Every hand is needed. Every body is a resource. And a wife's body, in my community, in my husband's understanding of scripture and tradition, was no different. Here is what people outside do not understand about Amish marriage. The theology of it is not just spiritual, it is physical. The bishop preached from Ephesians at our wedding. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. That was not metaphor in Kishacoquillas Valley. It was instruction. It was calendar. It was 4:30 in the morning in October with frost on the window glass, and a man who had decided that his need, his right, his God-given authority as head of household meant that my sleep and my body and my exhaustion were secondary considerations. Not cruelties. Secondary considerations. He would not have called it cruelty. He would not have called it anything. It simply was. The way the frost was. The way the dark was. I married Amos when I was 18. He was 26. He could build a straight fence line across 40 acres without a level. He could shoe a horse in the dark. He knew every weather sign that mattered, and none of the ones that didn't. He was not a soft man, but he was not a violent man. That is the part that took me years of therapy to hold correctly in my mind at the same time. That something can be done without violence and still be a harm. That a man can believe completely in his own rightness and still be wrong. Our courtship lasted 4 months. In my community, we did not practice bundling. That was considered too loose, too open to temptation. Instead, Amos came to sit in my parents' front room on Sunday evenings. My mother stayed nearby. We spoke about practical things, the farm he was building, how many acres he had cleared, whether his spring was reliable, whether I could manage a large garden. These were the things that mattered, not whether I wanted him, not whether I felt anything when he sat across from me. Those were not relevant questions. Or rather, they were questions a woman in Kishacoquillas Valley learned not to ask herself, because the asking led nowhere useful. We married in late October. The ceremony was at my parents' home. The benches were hard, the sermons were long. The bishop spoke for nearly 3 hours about Gelassenheit, yielding, about what it means for a woman to yield herself completely to God's order, which meant her husband's order, which meant the order of the farm and the family and the community. 312 people ate at our tables that day. I had been cooking since 4 in the morning. By the time Amos and I were alone, I had been awake for 20 hours. I was not prepared for that night. I am not going to tell you I was. No one had prepared me. My mother handed me a small folded cloth before I walked downstairs that morning and said only, "You will understand later." That was everything I was given. A folded cloth and a sentence I did not understand until it was already too late to use it. What happened in the weeks after our wedding? I have said some of this before in other places. The silence, the not knowing, the belief that pain was simply what being a wife required. What I want to tell you today is what came after. What hardened into pattern. What harvest season made worse because harvest season made everything worse. From the first week of October through the last day of field work, Amos woke before 4 in the morning every single day. And before he went to the barn, before he touched a tool or spoke to the farm hands or looked at the sky to read the weather, he came to me. Every dawn, without exception, as though it were part of the morning's work. Feed the horses, check the equipment, wake the wife. I want to be careful here about how I say what I am going to say, because there are things I cannot say directly on this platform. There are limits to what the camera permits, and I have learned exactly where those limits are. What I can tell you is this. I was not asked. I was not met with tenderness. I was not given time to wake fully or to understand what was happening, or to feel anything other than the obligation of it. In the Ordnung of my husband's mind, this was as much his right as the harvest itself. The crops needed to come in. The wife needed to be available. These were, to him, related facts, both part of what God had built the season for. I told my mother once. We were in her kitchen, October, the smell of apple butter on the stove, the windows foggy with steam. I chose my words carefully the way you learn to when you have grown up in a world where the wrong words make you the problem. I said, Amos is very demanding in the mornings. She stirred the pot for a long time before she answered. She said, that is what the harvest months are for. I did not say anything else. I stood there with the steam on my face, and I understood that this was not a problem she could see, because she had been taught not to see it, because her mother had been taught not to see it, because the Ordnung that nobody wrote down said that a wife's body in harvest season belonged to the harvest the same way the fields did, and any woman who felt differently about that was struggling with Hochmut, pride, the greatest sin in the plain world. I want to stop here for a moment. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you about the second harvest. Because the first year I endured it the way I had been taught to endure everything, with silence and with the belief that the enduring was itself a kind of faithfulness. But by the second harvest, I had begun to notice something that the Ordnung had not prepared me for. I had begun to notice my own anger. Not loudly, not the way anger looks from the outside. Amish women do not raise their voices. Amish women do not slam doors or cry in visible places. Amish women develop a different kind of anger, one that lives so deep inside the body that after a while it is hard to separate it from the body itself. It sits in the back of the throat during church. It moves through the hands while kneading bread. It is there in the dark at 4 in the morning when the quilt is pulled back and the ceiling is the only thing you are permitted to look at. My neighbor Ruth, I will call her Ruth, that is not her name. Ruth had been married 11 years when she first said anything to me. We were at a quilting bee in late September. She sat across from me, her hands moving fast, and even through the fabric, and she said without looking up, "Does Ezra come to you before the barn in the morning?" The question landed so quietly I almost missed it. I said, "Yes." She said, "So did mine. For 7 years. Every harvest. I thought it was the will of God until the year I got sick, and even then he came, and I understood it was not the will of God. It was the will of Ezra." We did not say anything else. The other women were 3 feet away. But something passed between us over that quilt in that room that I had not had a word for before. Ruth gave me the word later, standing at her fence line the way Amish women always share the things they are not permitted to share, sideways, looking somewhere else, quick enough to deny. She said, "What he does in the morning is not required by Scripture." I looked it up. I read every passage. It is not there. That sentence broke something open in me that I am not sure ever fully closed again. Because I had been told, we were all told, without being told directly, in the way the Ordnung works, in the way silence shapes belief, that a wife's complete availability was scriptural, was God-ordered, was as fixed as the seasons themselves. And here was Ruth, 11 years into her marriage, 3 children, a farmstead she had poured her body into, telling me she had read the passages. And it was not there. After I left, after the shunning settled in, after my parents' letters came back unopened, after the silence where my community used to be, I found a therapist. She was English. She asked careful questions. When I described the harvest mornings, the pre-dawn waking, the years of it, she did not look shocked. She looked like someone who had heard this before, which was its own kind of information. She said to me, "Demand is not the same as intimacy. Duty is not the same as love. And compliance that comes from fear of punishment, even when the punishment is spiritual, even when the punishment is God's disapproval, or a husband's disappointment, or a community's silence, compliance that comes from that is not freely given." I sat with that for a long time. In Kishocoquillas Valley, freely given was not a concept that applied to wives. You gave what was required. That was faithfulness. That was Gelassenheit, yielding. The whole theology of Amish womanhood is built on the idea that yielding is holy, that the self that you surrender is the self that gets saved. I believed that completely for the first 7 years of my marriage. I believed it the way you believe in the ground under your feet, not consciously, not with examination, just with your whole weight. What my therapist gave me, slowly, over many months, with patience I did not know I deserved, was the beginning of a different framework. One where my body was not a resource. One where dawn was not an obligation. One where a woman could read the same passages Ruth had read and arrive at a different conclusion than the one the bishop preached. I want to say something now that I could not have said in Kishocoquillas Valley. What Amos demanded every harvest morning was not about the harvest. It was about certainty, about owning something in a life where so much was uncertain, weather, crops, prices at the feed store, whether the frost would come before the corn was in. A wife's body, made available on demand, was the one thing a man in my community could be certain of. Because the Ordnung said so. Because the bishop confirmed it. Because every woman around him was too deep inside the same silence to say otherwise. That is not theology. That is control wearing theology's clothing. I grieve the girl who lay under her wedding quilt at 19, believing that the ceiling was the appropriate thing to look at. I grieve the 7 years of harvest mornings. I grieve Ruth's 11 years, and every woman in every plain community in every October darkness who has been taught that her exhaustion is a lesser consideration than the calendar. The Amish world gave me things I carry still, a capacity for hard work that has not left me, a knowledge of what genuine community feels like when it is working, the way an entire valley shows up for a barn raising, for a funeral, for the first cutting of hay. Faith that has been broken and rebuilt into something more honest than what I started with. But there is no passage in Scripture that requires a woman to be woken before dawn during harvest season. Ruth was right about that. I checked myself years later with an English Bible and a therapist sitting across from me, and no bishop standing at the edge of the room. It is not there. The ordnung that nobody wrote down is the most powerful document in any closed community. It does not need to be written because it is enforced by silence, by shame, by the complete absence of any voice that says, "This is not required. This is not God. This is a man, and men are fallible, and your body was never the harvest." If you grew up in a world where your compliance was called obedience, I see you. If you were woken before the light because someone had decided your rest was a smaller consideration than their need, I see you. If you were handed a folded cloth and a sentence you would not understand until it was too late, and no one thought to give you more than that, I see you. You were not too young to cook for 300 people. You were not too young to run a farmstead in the dark, but you were too young to be given that kind of authority over your own life and then told you had none. Knowledge is not hushmut. Understanding your own body is not pride, and any theology that requires a woman to be less than fully human in her own bedroom is a theology written by men who benefited from her silence. The harvest ends, the fields go quiet, the frost comes and the work slows and the valley settles into winter, but some mornings stay with you longer than the season that made them. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.